Hello, and thank you for coming back to part two of Ensuring a Peaceful Ending, where we're going to discuss making humane euthanasia decisions in the context of behavior and welfare of dogs. Before we dive in, I want to take a step back and talk about how euthanasia decisions have shifted over the past few decades, largely thanks to the no-kill movement. This movement has pushed shelters to prioritize life saving, moving us away from that sort of old school catch and kill approach that might have been prevalent in the 1970s towards more of a save in place model that I feel like most organizations are striving for today. Um, the movement also really galvanized public awareness. You've probably heard or even uttered the phrase adopt, don't shop. And really, it's that mindset that's helped fuel innovation in sheltering and adoption practices. And it's a big reason why euthanasia numbers for dogs and cats drop so dramatically, at least here in the US, but I imagine also other developed countries. I mean, we're talking a reduction from tens of millions to just under 1 million dog and cat euthanasias in shelters in the US alone. So that's huge. This is worth celebrating. But like many well-intentioned movements, there's also been some unintended consequences, particularly the emphasis on maintaining a 90% live release benchmark in order to claim that no kill, quote unquote, status. So, with funding and public opinion really tied to that number, shelters, especially our under-resourced or our open admissions shelters, they are feeling the pressure to avoid euthanasia at all costs, right? Their funding may depend on it, and their public perception may depend on it. And so, for dogs with behavior challenges, that means more of them are being kept in care or transferred out to the next organization, sometimes to rescues or shelters that maybe aren't well equipped to manage their needs. And as population numbers exceed capacity, these decisions now often translate to longer length of stay, which, as I mentioned in part one, is one of the greatest threats to any shelter dog's welfare, right? The longer they're staying, despite the best efforts and your resources, you are fighting an inevitable behavioral decline, which also means inevitable welfare decline. And also that we're potentially placing more and more dogs with behavior pathology. All right, so rather than playing the numbers game and passing the burden of behavior euthanasia onto those few organizations who don't make decisions based on an arbitrary number, at Gigi's we have more of what I call a no suffering approach, one that prioritizes the placement of adoptable, behaviorally sound dogs who, without intervention, will eventually become behaviorally challenged dog if their shelter stay increases. So we try to recognize without judgment or punishment that not all agencies have the resources nor capacity to save 90% of the dogs in their care. The idea is to promote a more welfare-centered sheltering model to focus on efforts that recognize and alleviate the suffering of animals that may be housed in shelters. And humane euthanasia is an acceptable means of stopping or preventing such suffering. Two recent movements toward this type of approach include Keep It Humane's effort towards SMART animal sheltering, so SMART, saving more animals responsibly together, as well as socially conscious animal communities pact model, and you can visit those websites for more information. So there are those of us who are really looking kind of to take a step back. Like we have done great achievements with the no kill movement, but we may have be on our path to maybe overcorrection and need to kind of think about the repercussions of this and how this is affecting particularly our behaviorally challenged dogs and those more under-resourced, poorer shelters. So as we shift to a more welfare-centric model for humane euthanasia decision-making, one must really gain fluency in the five domains model, as beautifully illustrated. I love this illustration that the ASPCA has on their website that's shown here. This more recent model expands on the five freedoms many of you may be familiar with from the animal welfare that was established by the Bramble Report in the 1960s when animal welfare really first became a concept. So as you can see here in this image, the four basic domains of nutrition, health, behavior, and environment are all going to directly influence the final domain, which is the mental state. In that shortcomings of any of these domains are going to lead to a mental state that's really not conducive to positive welfare. As well as that, even with the provision of adequate options for the other four domains, animals with behavior challenges and or pathologies may persist in a fearful, anxious, frustrated, or even lonely state. And that's not acceptable. So I find it can be helpful for shelters struggling with humane behavior euthanasia decisions to really look at this model and hold themselves accountable to it for each animal in their care, especially if we don't have an intervention plan in place. And so if we are looking at each dog individually and we are assessing them for these domains and realizing we are not meeting them, we have to have an intervention plan in place. Like doing nothing is not an option. But humane euthanasia is an option, and it's a perfectly acceptable option. Or let's say, despite intervention, you have a plan, and even as we regroup and recheck, the domains are still not being met. And another safe, humane, and reasonable option doesn't exist for this dog. While humane euthanasia is acceptable and actually probably recommended in that situation, right? You've put your resources in, you've done the intervention, we have a dog that is still struggling and suffering. And it's my personal and professional opinion that holding on to these dogs in a state of mental suffering in a shelter is in fact less humane than compassionately conducted euthanasia. Another equally important consideration when making placement versus humane euthanasia decisions for behavior dogs is impact that the placement is going to have on your local community. So this is particularly important for behavior pathology dogs with a history of uninhibited aggression. As even with the best of management, the risk of injury to people and dogs cannot be fully eliminated. We all know that management is only guaranteed to do one thing, and that is to fail at some point. And we sometimes think we're making a responsible placement by matching the environment to the dog risk. For example, like we place a dog with a history of severely biting a kid into a home without kids, or a dog with serious dog-to-dog aggression into a home without other dogs, right? But the reality is, children and other dogs exist in the community. And a home without kids doesn't mean the dog will never encounter children. Just as a single dog household doesn't eliminate the risk of encounters with dogs on walks, at the veterinary clinic, or other public spaces. And yes, severity and context of any bite absolutely matter and should always be a part of the evaluation. But also recognize that just because a risk can be managed doesn't always mean it should be. And if the likely consequence of a management failure is severe injury to a person or animal, we have to pause and ask whether that placement is truly an ethical choice. So just things to consider. When we talk about inhibited versus uninhibited aggression, which I've mentioned today as well as in my previous talk, we're really talking about a dog's ability or inability to hold back from causing injury during an aggressive incident. Probably mostly the most widely recognized tool is what I have here to describe bite inhibition is Ian Dunbar's bite assessment scale. I'm not going to go through each level and read it to you, but I do want to highlight that levels 1 and 2 are generally considered inhibited bites. One important point to remember is that bites happen in a fraction of a second. So the faster, they bite and retreat or don't bite and retreat faster than we can physically react as humans. So when someone says, oh, this dog tried to bite me, but I pulled my hand away fast enough, the truth is more likely that the dog showed inhibition in that moment. Inhibition is something learned young and likely influenced strongly by genetics. It also tends to wane as aggression is rehearsed. So each time a dog is put in a situation and forced to choose to use aggression to protect itself, the likelihood of losing inhibition increases. And dogs that have already delivered an uninhibited bite are especially concerning. Research presented several years ago at our veterinary behavior symposium, looking at reported bite cases in the US, showed that once a dog had delivered a bite, so the dogs that had reported bites, after they delivered that initial bite, any future bites reported were likely to be just as severe, if not worse. They didn't get less severe with time. And so if a dog learns that this level of aggression is necessary to feel safe, if I need to bite you to a level 3 in order to feel safe, that I have safely made a threat go away, that they're likely to bite to a level 3 or higher when they're faced with that same situation again. It's all about learning, and bite severity matters, at least in the decision-making process. So with that information in mind, let's talk about considerations for aggressive dogs in this decision-making process. So the first step in determining whether or not that dog with the bite history meets the criteria for safe adoption is to ask yourself, well, is it possible that someone could safely manage this dog? Just possible in the world, right? Step 2, while there may be management steps that could be taken to safely manage this dog, is this management still going to allow this dog to have a humane quality of life? Can its mental state, welfare domain be met um, if we're having to manage it so tightly? And if the dog is currently being housed or planned to be housed in your shelter, is the management needed in order to maintain that safety and provide that quality of life reasonable? It's possible, but is it reasonable for your shelter to undertake? What resources would you need to devote, and how high is the risk of management failure, right? Now, what about an adopter? Is it reasonable to expect an adopter to take on the needed management and work to prevent an aggressive interaction and still provide a meaningful quality of life for that dog? While a lot's possible, it needs to be reasonable. And if you're going to make responsible adoption decisions, we really have to take this into mind. A lot also is going to depend on your adopter profile and your adoption counseling capabilities. So for us at Gigi's, we're trying to remove as many barriers to adoption as possible so that we can have the highest volume adoption as possible. And we want our adopters to be able to choose from as many dogs as possible. So we're really trying to keep our restrictions to a minimum. This means we may have some very green, very novice adopters, and we need to be able to provide them with a safe and enjoyable pet. So now your smaller foster-based rescues may have the benefit of being more restricted towards their adopter base. Especially if the dog's stable and comfortable in a foster home, nobody's in a rush for the dog to find placement, they're not facing a behavior euthanasia decision because the dog's having good welfare in a home, they have the luxury of being picky, right? And they can say, I need this dog to go to home with this structure, with this type of fence, in this type of environment, because maybe a rural environment is going to be more fitting than an urban environment where there's too many triggers. For high volume shelters, though, it's a different kind of pressure, and we just don't have the luxury otherwise. We end up having most of our dogs on our adoption floor have restrictions that prevent a lot of our average adopter from being able to adopt. So let's go through some examples now. So number one, you have a dog surrendered to you for attacking and killing the neighbor's chickens. So we get our dogs from a rural area in Southern Ohio, so we actually have this history come to us quite a bit. But if we're going to walk through this scenario, the questions, the first is it possible to safely manage this dogs? I mean, I don't have the right answers here. Again, answers are going to be different based on where you are and what your organization's resources and capabilities are. But I'd say for us, typically the answer is yes. We can most likely prevent a dog from accessing chickens either by not allowing the dog access to those areas or making sure chickens are housed securely or, homing them in an area where they're not going to be even close to them. And in managing this dog safely, if we don't allow this dog to be around chickens, is it still going to have a quality of life? Probably. I mean, most dogs, I think, probably have decent quality of life if we forever prevent them from accessing chickens, but I can't say never. Is the management necessary, reasonable for your shelter to undertake? And well, I'd say unless you are housing chickens and dogs in proximity in your shelter, it's probably pretty easy to manage. Although there's going to be, humane agencies that maybe they just did a raid and have brought in roosters by the hundreds. Maybe that isn't reasonable for that shelter. Again, the context and each situation matters. So what about an adopter? If you have the ability to be transparent, discourage adopters who have chickens or live adjacent to free-roaming chickens from adopting, it's probably pretty reasonable. That said, this is going to be geographically dependent. So I teach at St. Matthew's University in Grand Cayman. Let me tell you, there are chickens everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. So this is going to be very difficult to manage. And so adopters really need to disclose that they may have a chicken killer on their hand, and unless they want to see this happen before their very eyes, they're going to be very careful about where they walk them. But again, for us in our more urban suburban environment, fairly easy to manage. All right, next, delving into aggression directed at companion animals. So this example is of a dog that's returned to the shelter after killing a stray cat in the adopter's yard. First question, is it possible to safely manage? Well, just like chickens, it's probably possible, although I'd say there's probably more stray cats and cats in the world than there are chickens in a lot of these environments. And so the management may be a little more restrictive. Do they still have a quality of life if we're not allowing them around cats? Probably. Again, I'm not saying that these are the right answers. I'm just kind of walking through what our answers are when we're faced with this situation. And is the management necessary to maintain the safety of cats and quality of life for the dog? Is it reasonable for our shelter? Well, we're dogs only. So for us, it's very reasonable because we don't have to worry about interactions between dogs and cats. And so for an adopter, I think it's all about disclosure, right? There are certainly dogs that have had a predatory response to stray cats that live very safely with a companion cat in their home. Am I going to put this dog in a home with other cats? Probably not. I would strongly discourage it. And just let people know if they've got a lot of stray cats or indoor outdoor cats in their neighborhood. I mean, they're going to be at risk if this dog has access to them. So, again, and this is up to the shelter, and some shelters draw the line at cats, and I think that's completely reasonable, depending on what works for you and your adopters. Now to a case of human-directed aggression. Here we get a bit deeper into the gray zone. In this example, we have a dog that's turned in who bit a child on the hand. Now, it didn't break skin, and this was in response to a pretty clear trigger. So the child was taking away a bone. Do we think it's possible to safely manage this dog? Well, if this were a client coming to me in an appointment, I'd say, all right, we're either not going to give the dog bones or we're going to manage the children and we're going to supervise them all the time and make sure they are never trying to take away a bone. That's easier said than done as a parent of two children. Kids can follow rules to some extent, but if let's say it's their toy that the dog steals, it can be a knee-jerk reaction for that kid to want to grab it away from them. So but anyways, in the world, it's probably possible to safely manage this dog, particularly because it didn't break skin. So this is what we call an inhibited bite. So should this situation occur again, heaven forbid, the hope is that the damage is still very limited. So we don't have an actual bite or injury to a child. Now, that's not to account for the psychological damage. I'm sure it was very traumatizing for this child, but just something to consider. And so if we're not allowing this dog to have bones and be around kids, is he still going to have a quality of life? Probably, I would say. And for our shelter, most of us are not employing children, hopefully. So I think it's probably pretty easy to manage in the shelter. So now the question is for the adopter. I mean, clearly this is a full disclosure. But again, if you walk yourself into a situation where it's a purebred dog and people are just die hard in fantasy land of, oh, I don't care, it'll be fine. I won't let my kids, take the bone away. I won't let them bother them. This is a risk. Like this is still a potential risk to humans. And so it's something each shelter has to consider. Are you a shelter that has no ability to even interview or talk to your adopter or even to disclose this information? You may not feel comfortable putting this dog into your adoption population, and that's okay. Again, I don't have the right answers here. It's just walking through this to think about it so that you really look at, not just the possibility of management, but what is reasonable for your adopters to undertake, and how can we help it be reasonable and help them make informed decisions. Next, a dog that climbed a fence and severely injured a neighbor's dog being walked down the street. So I had this happen to one of my patients when I was practicing at the university. They had a pretty shabby fence, and the dog had a history of climbing it and chasing after other dogs. And so I said, you need to treat your backyard like you don't have a fence, and it could never be out there unless it's on a leash. Like that was our management plan. We're going to safely manage this dog by always having it on a leash, never allowing it loose in that yard or any yard for that matter, right? So the thought and what I prescribed was a safe management plan, okay? And yes, that dog had a great quality of life. He got to go outside, but on a leash, and he just never was allowed off leash in a way that he could potentially have risk of going after another dog. Now, in a shelter environment, this dog did a lot of injury to that other dog. And so if you are a densely packed shelter with lots of volunteers and lots of dogs walking in every which way, the management might be tricky, right? You may be putting other dogs in your shelter, or potentially the people walking those dogs at risk. So it's something to think about. And then what about an adopter, right? So we have to tell them that this dog is dangerous if it gets access to other dogs. Oh, that's okay. I have a fence. It's secure. Okay, but you know, what happens to management is that it fails, right? So my clients forgot about the rule and they let the dog go in their yard with the shabby fence for just a minute to go to the bathroom. And in that 1 minute, a child was walking its Yorkie past the yard and the dog jumped the fence and nearly killed that Yorkie in front of that child. Devastating. So the consequences, if this were to happen, are just dire. So you got to think about that. This is, for us at Gigi's, this is probably not something we would find reasonable for an adopter to undertake. That level of injury to another dog is too risky to put in the community. Yet I recognize each organization has a different line and a different way to manage and counsel adopters and support them. So I'm not here to judge that. I'm just here to ask you to ask these questions of yourselves and make sure it really is reasonable for your adopter pool. Next, a dog that will growl, bark, and lunge at other female dogs if they get in her face. Is it possible to safely manage this? Well, sure. We just don't let other female dogs get in her face, right? If we manage that and not let dogs in her face, is she going to have a quality of life? Well, heck yeah. Probably a better quality of life if we don't allow it, right? And is the management necessary, reasonable for you to undertake? That's going to depend on the shelter, right? How many dogs do you have? Are they able to be individually walked, housed, or is it a shelter where group life is part of this and there's going to be dogs in her face and those dogs are, potentially going to get hurt? I mean, in this scenario, again, we have growling, barking, and lunging. We don't have actual biting. So you have inhibition. So should someone mess up and allow dogs to get together, at least the consequence isn't as devastating, at least the first few times. So same with an adopter, right? It's something we could disclose to them and allow them to make that choice. But what I don't know is, do I trust that adopter to follow those rules? And if this dog is continually put in a situation where female dogs are in her face, will she change from an inhibited bite to one that's less inhibited? I don't know, and I can't predict that. And so, again, not a right answer, but something to think about for each of these dogs. So for us, this is a dog we probably feel could easily manage because we could disclose it. We do have the ability to counsel our adopters. And again, this was an inhibited reaction from this dog towards other female dogs. Not one that's displaying leash activity or running across a yard to attack other dogs. She just doesn't like them up in her personal space. All right, lastly, a dog that trusts a few familiar people but barks, lunges, and tries to bite, in fact, has bitten other people. So I see this in so many shelters where I consult, where we have this history. So the first question is it possible to safely manage this dog? I was in clinical behavior practice for over a decade, and yes, I counsel people on how to do this. Um, in most of these cases, was there a point where management failed and this happened? Yes, most of the time. But in theory, it is possible with lots of rules to safely manage this dog. And we can do it with having a quality life. Depends on the home, though, right? If you also have a dog that has separation anxiety or confinement anxiety, and we can't, safely separate it from anyone coming into our home that's a stranger, well, that might be tough. And then, how does that work for that adopter, right? So in the shelter, it may be possible to manage this dog in a shelter if all handlers are familiar to the dog. What if there's only one or two familiar handlers that work in the shelter? What if one of them or both of them are sick or on vacation? Who else can handle the dog? Does that mean that dog doesn't get walked that day? Does that mean they don't get their physical exercise and the rest of their behavioral needs met? Right? That's something to consider. Then we have to think about the adopter, right? So let's say everyone in the shelter has established familiarity, and so those people are safe to interact. But then we have to get a new person who isn't bonded to this dog to create a relationship, which is going to take some work to become familiar. And then accept that this is a pathology. And as I mentioned, pathologies are going to persist in the home. And so now every stranger who walks into their home or approaches this dog on a walk is going to face this same risk. And so this is a situation we at Gigi's would not meet adoption criteria for us because that's the risk to the community is too much. Even if the dog had established, bonds and was safe to be around every worker at Gigi's. And sometimes we don't find this out until they're adopted or until someone unfamiliar comes onto our campus and we see that this dog truly has that kind of stranger directed fear related aggression. But again, this is each shelter's individual choice. Just sharing for us, we would feel the risk to the community would be too great. Even if the dog was safe to handle in the shelter, know that that behavior is going to persist and show up again once they're placed in a home. All right, so in many cases, you may not have enough information to make a quick decision on placement versus humane euthanasia for dogs with aggression or really any behavior challenge. So I'm going to take you on a little journey here. Bear with me. I tried to create an algorithm to help walk through what the process might look like, taking capacity and resources into consideration for dogs with challenges. So let's say you have a dog presents to you, whether it's being surrendered or it's being returned. It's got a history of some sort of moderate behavior challenge, something that falls into your gray zone of safe placeability. And as we just walk through, you start by asking yourself if this behavior can be safely, humanely, and reasonably managed in an adoptive home, right? Can someone really do this? Your answer is either going to be no, not sure, or yes, right? If the answer is a clear no, then humane euthanasia should be performed immediately. Don't let this dog languish in the shelter for any longer than is necessary. But if the answer is yes, then you have to determine whether or not your shelter has the capacity to support this dog's behavior challenges and to manage the triggers. So, do you have capacity? If the answer is yes, well, you get your behavior team on it, you get a BMOD plan, a psychofarm plan, and you get to work. And then you reassess periodically, every few days, every week, is the behavior improving? If it's yes, great. We adopt them or put them in what we call foster to adopt, if that's something that other shelters utilize, where they're sort of temporarily in the home, but it's not a full commitment. And we support them, right? Provide them with full disclosure, and here's all the things you need to help manage this dog's behavior. And then in the home, we follow up. Is it manageable? If the answer is yes, great. Adoption finalized, success. But if we discover it's not, and after all of that work in the behavior and we thought it was improving, but in the home it's not, and this is a pathology that's persistent, that's probably the information we need to then make that behavior euthanasia decision. Let's say we go back to, we've enacted our behavior mod plan, the behavior is not improving. Now what? We've put resources into this, the dog's not getting better. We'll have to think, well, how long's this dog been with us? Is their length of stay over 30 days? Because when we look at our numbers, over 30 days, we start to see a poor outcome. We just do statistically. But so if they've not been there very long, we just revise our plan, change the meds, try again, right? Is the behavior improving? Now they've been there longer. Our length of stay is over 30 days. Uh-oh, this is getting dire. Now I'm seeing more decline despite my best effort. Do I have one of those special fosters available who will really give us honest feedback and we're not putting them into a naive first-time foster who's going to be crushed if this doesn't work out and we have to make a euthanasia decision? If not, then it might be time to make that euthanasia decision now. If yes, well, great. Get them into special foster, support the heck out of them, and then discover, is this behavior manageable? And if it is, wonderful. You post them for adoption, get them into adoption or foster to adopt, support them for success. But if in that special foster you discover it really isn't manageable, this dog's not safe, this dog's not okay, then at that point we make that humane euthanasia decision. Okay, so let's say your organization does not have the capacity to support or manage. You think this is probably something that could be managed, but we don't have the resources to put any effort into helping this. So then we have to think about, well, do I have a transfer option? Is there another organization that can support this dog? And if the answer is yes, transfer them. And that's we at Gigi's. We take dogs from our partner shelters that have no means of helping any of these dogs. But if you're stuck and you're an organization, you don't have any resources to help this dog, you have no transfer options, at that point, euthanasia may be the kindest, most humane option rather than subjecting this dog to an extended length of stay and further decline. Let's say you aren't sure if this is a behavior that can be reasonably managed in a home. If that's the case, you might consider either a professional consult to get an assessment and or a special foster or both, right? So put them into special foster, have a professional assess them and consult and give a plan. And then we can ask, is this behavior manageable? And if it's yes, great. Foster to adopt, get them up for placement, support them. And in that foster to adopt home, if the behavior is still manageable, great, success, adoption. If it's not, though, we've gone through special foster, we've gone through professional support, and it's not manageable when we try to place it in a forever home, at that point, considering humane euthanasia is very reasonable. Now, if that special foster is still available and willing, and let's just say there were circumstances of this final home that were just, it wasn't the dog's, it wasn't about the dog's behavior, it was more about the home. Like sometimes we can put them back in a special foster, but I'm only going to do that if I do think that it's reasonable this dog can be successful. And then if we try again in the special foster and we discover they really aren't manageable, at that point, we consider making a humane euthanasia decision. So not easy, it's complicated, and this is my best attempt to put it objectively. So we also want to think about making mindful decisions. So we do weekly pathway planning sessions. So representatives from all walks of the shelter are discussing all of our dogs, gather information. What are the community needs? Prioritize our foster requests, and we will discuss our humane euthanasia potentials each week, right? I don't want to let these things slip and go weeks on end. When needed, let's say we have an acute urgent situation, we do what's called a stand-up, where we just get everyone on our team together to stop what they're doing and talk, review the 5 domains, review the safety as well as adoptability, and we go through a series of questions. So here's some examples, cases of questions we go through. So a dog with intense fear and anxiety. So our first question is, are we meeting the 5 domains for this dog? And if they're subject to constant fear and anxiety, the answer is going to be no for their mental state. And so then I have to think, all right, well, what's the current psychopharm plan? Can it be adjusted without excessively sedating the dog? And if it is, then great, I will. Um, but if not, let's say I've been here a while, I've exhausted my psychopharm plan. Do I have information on how this dog even does in a home? Like, do I know that they are a good pet? And if so, let's say they used to be in a foster, they're back at the shelter, they were a great pet. Well, I am going to launch everything I can to social media, getting these dogs out to upcoming events. If I know that they are a great pet in a home, I'm going to do whatever I can to get them the heck out of there. But if I don't have that option, if that home never comes, I can't let this dog languish in the shelter because at some point they're not going to be an okay pet anymore, right? Okay, so then medical issues. We look at our 5 domains. Let's say we're not meeting the health domain for some sort of medical condition, which also means their mental state is going to be effective. And so, is this medical condition, does it have a reasonably affordable treatment option that's going to resolve the issue and also not cause prolonged physical or emotional pain and discomfort? Do we have the resources? Do we have a foster option for their recovery? And also, key is the dog behaviorally and emotionally resilient enough to undergo the necessary treatment or procedure? Because you might have the resources to pay for that surgery, but if this dog is going to completely break going through it, it's probably not a good idea, right? And then with aggression, as we've talked about a little bit, we're not meeting a behavior state, which also means we're not meeting the mental state domain. Are they a safety risk? Again, walking through all our same questions for management. And then we ask additional questions. What's their length of stay? How many adopters have considered them? How do the meet and greets go? What greeting behaviors can we improve? And if there's not interest, you know, can their photo be improved? And does allocating additional resources to improve them really affect other dogs in our care? Because if we're putting all the resources in this dog, they're not going to the other dogs. And so also thinking about our other intake needs from our partners. So we take in dogs from other shelters. And if we continue to work with this one dog in our shelter, that might hinder adoption opportunities for a lot of available dogs in the other shelters who are inevitably going to decline. So ideal practices, we're communicating with our team. We have a pre-medication plan so that they are nice and relaxed when it's time for an intramuscular sedative. And then we give that euthanasia solution when they're fully unconscious. We have pre-procedure oral pharmaceuticals. I'll share all of these in notes so you have them, including the detomidine mucosal gel with all of these doses. If it's not safe to apply it directly to a dog's gum, we can combine it with food for them to lick and have extended mucosal contact time. We want to make sure we create a calm, safe space with lickable foods, soft blankets, music, white noise. This dog here is not being euthanized, but it still, our euthanasia dog should be able to achieve the same state of relaxation. There are lots of tricks and tips that we can do that I will put in the notes for sedating fearful and aggressive dogs, one including utilizing our butterfly catheters here. This allows us to give an intramuscular injection while a dog is eating and distracted and get away very, very quickly and safely, and the dog can go back to eating. I will also post these injectable sedative doses that can be used to help achieve a state of unconsciousness before that IV injection. And just remember that even though dogs sedated, they can jump out of sedation and bite, so making sure we have head control with various options that I've described here. So want to learn more about chemical restraint? Scan this code here. My book, Introduction to Animal Behavior, Veterinary Behavioral Medicine, has a chapter dedicated just to chemical restraint. Fear Free Shelters also has a number of resources in their free online programming. And those of you interested in taking the leap across the pond or joining us virtually, the Veterinary Behavior Symposium will be in Seattle, Washington this year in June. Researchers from around the world presenting current research on the field of animal behavior, including multiple shelter-related studies. And backed by popular demand, we'll also have the practical behavior forum on day 2, where this year we're going to have a third of the program dedicated to behavior euthanasia decision-making and best practices. So registration will open in the next few weeks. Scan here to join. And again, thank you so much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference.